I'm Wanjiru Gikonyo. Welcome to the Elephant Cast. Today we are discussing a subject that's very close to, well, the hearts of many Kenyans. It's a very topical issue. We're talking about the elections of the 26th of October, and our big question is, should these elections go ahead? And we're going to look at the issues surrounding the elections, what has brought us here, and more importantly, what do we need to do to get out of this electoral impasse? And so we're very honored today to have with us a constitutional expert who speaks on many issues and has made time to be with us today, Wachira Maina.
Good morning, viewers.
Karibu sana.
Asante.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'll just, just start off with where we are. We are 2 days away from the election. And a week ago, the IEBC issued a 10-point agenda on how it had reviewed its systems to conform with the Supreme Court ruling. And they said they are ready for the election on the 26th. We then witnessed the resignation of one of the commissioners, citing a lot of concerns about the IEBC. We then had a very shocking statement from the IEBC chair, who said he's not able to ensure the credibility of the election. Of course, we are aware that the Jubilee, the government side, has insisted that the election must go on, and it appears that the election may go on. And so the question is, in your view as a constitutional expert, given all these concerns, should the election go on as planned?
I think, Wachira, the first thing to realize is that there isn't a neat constitutional answer to that question. What I mean by that is, what we are going through right now is not a constitutional crisis in the classical sense. It is a political crisis. And what we have is a country that is divided down the middle. One side has taken a view that it doesn't want to participate in the election because it thinks the fundamental conditions for a free and fair elections do not exist. And the other side is determined to continue with the election, partly because of reasons of formal legitimacy. What I mean by that is, the government feels, or Uhuru Kenyatta feels, that it is important for him to be president of Kenya before he can engage with his opponents. And he needs that formality of having gone through an election and having the imprimatur of being the president of the republic. Now, what the best the election can do is to confer on him that formal legitimacy. But from a moral legitimacy point of view, from a political legitimacy point of view, the election is not going to give him what he wants, which is following around the country. He's going to keep the polarities in the country as they are right now. So, in short, yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion on TV about the legalities of it. I don't think even if we agreed we could have a neat legal problem solution out of this, I don't think it would help, because the underlying problem is political, and that's what needs to be addressed.
Okay. Do you believe that the withdrawal by Raila, still on the subject, it is political, the withdrawal by Raila Odinga from the electoral process was justified? Do you believe there were enough grounds? Because his supporters out there feel that the IEBC has not done enough.
Yeah.
So was it justified for him to withdraw, or was it just a ploy to go for a caretaker government, to go for the nusu mkate argument that Jubilee is fronting?
Yeah. I, for one, don't believe that NASA has been in this because they want a nusu mkate government. I think the preference of NASA would have been to win power outright and be in power in their own right. I think that's their A game, their first game. The nusu mkate argument is an argument that has a reason in the context of people arguing that it is important for Raila and Uhuru Kenyatta to do dialogue. But you've got to go back to the Supreme Court decision to see why it was inevitable that NASA would withdraw from the elections. And I argued that they would withdraw from the elections. The Supreme Court identified a series of illegalities that the IEBC had committed. And subsequently, the assumption was that IEBC would address each of those illegalities. But midstream, the Jubilee side, using its majority in both houses, decided to amend the laws, basically to defeat some of the findings of the Supreme Court decision. So, picture yourself in NASA. The Supreme Court has said that a lot of illegalities were committed by IEBC, and that IEBC didn't have a basis. The upshot really was that the IEBC didn't have a basis for announcing the result that they announced. Now, rather than fix that problem that the Supreme Court had identified, what the Jubilee administration then did was to change the laws to conform in many ways with what the dissenters were saying, and not what the majority decision had said. So, armed with the moral authority that NASA was armed with, namely that illegalities have been committed and therefore the election result is not one that is verifiable in terms of the Constitution, you would be foolish to participate in an election until you are guaranteed that those minimum conditions are met. Because if you participate in an election and the minimum conditions identified by the Supreme Court have not been satisfied, you do not have a basis subsequently for saying that the election is illegal a second time. And you also increase the possibility that if the Supreme Court were to decide a second time that if were to decide on a second petition that the elections were held according to law, then you've lost the moral high ground you had from the first decision. So all things considered, it wasn't in the interest of NASA to participate in an election unless it was clear to them that every aspect of the Supreme Court decision had been fulfilled.
Okay, let's go back a little bit. You're on record, as you have just said now, as saying this is a political crisis. It's not a crisis in law.
No.
And this emanates far back beyond this particular election.
Yes.
Could you tell us, speak a little bit to what are these drivers that we have carried along that, are really poisoning our electoral process?
Yeah. Now, I think this is going to take a bit of time, but let me try and sort of frame it in the way I think it really is. First, let's not be in doubt that we have a political crisis, because a political crisis, if you want, is to be, you can define it in terms of an unresolvable political problem that can provoke a social breakdown or political breakdown, but which the institutions as they exist cannot resolve, or the individual leaders, in this case Uhuru and Raila, are incapable or unwilling to resolve. So in terms of a political crisis, if you thought about it that way, that the institutions are incapable of resolving it and the leaders are unable or unwilling to resolve the problem, then you do have a political crisis. Now, the nature of this particular crisis is that, first, again, to frame it in very broad terms, is that the traditional checks and balances, the way they work, is the judiciary checks the executive checks the legislature, and both, and they all, it's like a machine that balances, checks and balances. Now, the executive in this case is the subject of contestation. That's what they are fighting over. The judiciary, the government feels, or the Jubilee side feels, it cannot control the judiciary, so it's suspicious of it. The NASA feels it doesn't control Parliament, so it cannot, it doesn't trust it. So you've got the three arms of government. One is a subject of contestation. The other one is not trusted by one side, and the other is not trusted by the other side. So that's the heart of the institutional crisis. And then, of course, there is a personality issue driven by the fact that Uhuru and Raila, they come from these families that have been in this contestation since independence. Now, where is this coming from? This is coming from a historical problem about the nature of the state in Kenya. And the nature of the state in Kenya, I like to say that Kenya is a child of the railway line. Because if you don't understand the railway line in Kenya, you don't understand the politics of Kenya. Now, the British built a railway line in Kenya partly because they wanted to control the headwaters of the Nile. And they wanted to control the headwaters of the Nile because they were in Egypt. And Egypt represented the shortest route to India, which was a jewel in the imperial crown. And the idea was that if you didn't control the headwaters of the Nile, you didn't control Egypt. So they built a railway line in a place where nobody lived. And no white person lived, I should have said that. When no white person lived. And the question then became how you make the railway line pay for itself. And in a nutshell, what then happened was everything in Kenya was focused on the railway line. And developments, roads, schools, infrastructure was all built within 160 miles of the railway line, about 240 kilometers of the railway line. That's where all developments were done. This led to a very significant geographical concentration of power. This is a highly, power in Kenya is highly centralized. In fact, geographically speaking, it's highly centralized. So what happened historically was, if you look at the 8 provinces we used to have, each provincial headquarters was either on the railway line or within 22 kilometers of the railway line. And that was Embu. The only headquarters that was not on the railway line was Garissa, which was the forward base for Ethiopia, for Somalia, if you see what I mean. So that the state evolved as very concentrated. Now, what that also meant was, if you think about Kenya, identity tends to follow geography. So even ethnic groups tend to occupy particular territory. So what happened in Kenya was, the ethnic groups that were within the 240 kilometers of the railway line also were inserted into the colonial economy very early on. So you had a geographically concentrated state, an ethnically concentrated state, and basically within that area I've just described, which is the area within the railway line, what you had were the Mount Kenya communities, the Central Highlands of the Rift, the communities in the Central Highlands of the Rift, Nandi, Kipsigis, the Kalenjin group cluster, and then you had the Luyas and the Luos, and of course the Kisis. So the state was ethnically concentrated around those ethnic groups. At independence, what we decided to do was to adopt Sessional Paper Number 10, African Socialism and its Application to Planning of 1966. And the government said that the government resources would be invested in the areas where they could earn the highest return. What did this mean? This meant exactly the same regions that the colonial government had invested in, which were the areas within 220 kilometers of the railway line. Now that story, so far, explains why all national schools in Kenya were within that area, all major hospitals in Kenya were within that area, all roads were built as feeders to the railway line. That explains that. But where are the pastoralists in these stories? In this story that I've just put out, the pastoralists are very difficult to repress historically, and always have been, because they don't occupy territory, and they don't occupy territory for any length of time. Territory is essential to repression, and that's why farmers are so easy to repress. And then the populations are not stable because they keep shifting. So pastoralism challenges the state. So what the colonial government did was basically to ignore them and to put an institutional and legal barrier. The Outlying Districts Act, the Special District Administration Act, which basically said pastoralists couldn't come into the settled areas. So they were kept out. And that area was considered useless Kenya. The pastoralist areas were considered useless Kenya. So useful Kenya was within 240 kilometers of the railway line, and useless Kenya was everywhere outside of that region. And this is how the politics of Kenya evolved. So, because what then happened, politics was played in the railway zone. So, and how it worked was, you would get a block, an ethnic block. If you are Kikuyu, you mobilize Mount Kenya, and then one more group outside of Mount Kenya, and that was enough to get you then a block of votes, which would then allow you to fill in with a few pastoralist votes. Then you that's how you delivered electoral victory. If you are Luo, you did the same thing. You mobilized the Luos and another 1 or 2 groups, but not the Kikuyu for historical reasons, which we can talk about. So that ethnicity and the railway line and the way the zone was organized, it became the basis on which we organized our politics. And the pastoralists became a reservoir for filling in. So you would bribe them. So if you look at how Moi ran the country for many years, what would happen is he would get his Kalenjin vote and the Luya vote, and then he would fill in with a few additional votes from the pastoralist areas. And the pastoralists kept shifting. One time it was the Maasai, the other time it's Somalis. So he would play them. It was a scheme of bribery, basically. So that's the way the politics evolved. So this is the structure of Kenyan politics as it has evolved for the last almost 100 years. Now, what happened with the devolution, which is where the story changes. What happened with devolution is that the pastoralist areas that had been historically neglected got resources. It is the first time that they had experienced resources. They had never had resources. So, they are no longer available for bribery in the traditional sense, because the central government has historically not been able to show pastoralists that it exists for them. In fact, every time the central government has tried to do anything with the pastoralists is to try and make them sedentary. Sedentarization is to try and make them sedentary so that they can repress them and control them. And the pastoralists have resisted this. So, and devolution has now empowered them, because devolution gives them resources, and they feel, in fact, the more resources they can get, the better. Because pastoralists have lived their lives surviving in the central state. Now they've got a government at the local level which they can live with. So they are no longer available for bribery. What that has done is to make the fight in the railway zone more intense, because you no longer have the pastoralists available for bribery. And you could see, even the way the election was run in 2017, a lot of efforts were being made in the pastoralist areas. And you remember President Uhuru Kenyatta going to Turkana and calling the governor names. This is a reflection of the frustration that he is feeling on account of what devolution has done. So in a nutshell, these are the structures of Kenyan politics, and this is what is, unless you understand that logic, that the state has been geographically concentrated, ethnically concentrated, with pastoralists as a reservoir votes, and now that this is being undermined by devolution, which has made the contest at the center even severer, you won't be able to explain this crisis, because we'll be focusing too much on the formalities of the institution. And then one might ask, but I thought the new constitution solved this problem.
Exactly. Because you see, the ethnic voting blocks, I think, has been used without fully appreciating the extent to which this is actually where the problem lies.
Yes.
It's also the solution in a way, because when you talk about ethnicity, I mean, we're a nation of diverse ethnic groups, and we need to tap that diversity. And it seems we haven't been able to turn our ethnicity into a positive thing.
Yes.
It's still playing negatively.
Yes.
Now, the Constitution, as you're about to say, sought to one, deal with negative ethnicity, two, infuse the checks and balances on power, and disperse this power to deal with this problem. So maybe you could speak a little bit to what are the concrete things the Constitution sought to do. And why haven't they worked? Because things seem to be getting worse rather than better.
I think you've got to remember that we've made the Constitution of Kenya in two truncated processes. Actually, if you want, maybe three truncated processes. Because you remember we had the first era of minimum reforms, which began in 1992, all the way to 1997 IPPG reforms. So we had the first era of sort of minor changes. And you remember in 1997, we created a framework for reviewing the Constitution after the election. The CKRC Act. And then the actual process of reviewing the Constitution began after that election of 1997, in 1998. That's when the process began in the earlier steps to try and form a commission to do the Constitution. And it got underway in a significant way in 2003. Now, that first phase went collecting views in the country. The summary of those views, I was critical of it then, and I remain critical. But the summary of those views was very revealing, because the preference, according to the final report that Professor Yashgai did, the final report showed that Kenyans preferred a parliamentary system, not a presidential system. And the Constitution, as drafted, was then taken to, I think it was Malindi, where there was a gathering of politicos and the Attorney General then, Senator Amos Wako. They got involved in looking at the draft that came out of the CKRC process. That draft was changed in some significant ways and was taken to referendum and lost, which was one of the immediate triggers for the 2007 crisis, that we didn't have a new constitution, and the framework that existed then could not resolve a political disagreement in 2007 between Raila Odinga and Mwai Kibaki. So we went to now the third phase of making the constitution out of the materials that had emerged between 1998 and 2005. We used that same material to begin a fresh process of constitution making. We didn't collect new views afresh. And same process happened. We took the materials that had been collected. A sort of high-level elite consultations took place. The constitution was taken to Naivasha, and it was changed. It was mutilated in very significant respects and changed to a presidential system. Why am I giving this history? It is to respond to the question that why didn't the constitution resolve the underlying structure? If you look at how other countries make constitutions, let's say South Africa. In South Africa, the making of the constitution was a bargain between owners of capital and owners of labor. And part of the reason why the South African constitution has got economic and social rights was because labor wanted those rights. I mean, health, decent jobs, those sort of things. The labor wanted those rights, and capital also wanted to protect itself with strong institutions and property rights. So that was a bargain between labor and capital. What is our constitution a bargain between? This is the fundamental problem, because if the structural drivers are identity, economic marginalization arising from the fact some areas were neglected first by colonial policy, and secondly by Session of Paper Number 10 and its application to socialism, application to planning in Kenya. If that is what drove the economic marginalization, you would think that the negotiations related to the constitution would fundamentally revolve around resolving that underlying problem. They didn't. Yeah. So we ended up with a constitution which in many ways doesn't speak to the realities, the political realities of the country. That is the fundamental problem.
So what you're saying is that due to whichever factors, we have a constitution that missed the core of the problem.
Yes, it did.
And this is about power.
It's about power,
how power is exercised, and how the 43 or 44 ethnic groups are represented by government.
Absolutely.
So it's back to the presidential parliamentary debate.
Yes.
Which, of course, to some sections of the country is an anathema. You cannot discuss anything outside of. How do we get round this? Because Central Kenya, I imagine, believes parliamentary system seeks to decimate them and will appropriate their resources. There's a big fear. There was a fear about devolution.
Yes.
And this is, I think, an even bigger fear.
Yes.
Yes. So what would this look like? How do we have this conversation?
The strange thing is this, that in fact, contrary to what Central Kenya thinks, long term, a parliamentary system is actually better for them than a presidential system. Because first of all, let me frame this in a way that probably makes sense. As an empirical fact, as a matter of evidence, the presidential system has done terribly in sustaining democracy around the world. Yeah, because the two longest stable presidential democracies is Costa Rica and the United States. Latin America, which borrowed the presidential system from America, is a graveyard of constitutions. In fact, more constitutions have collapsed in Latin America than have collapsed in Africa, with fewer countries, more than 400. Haiti alone, more than 100. So the presidential system has not been a success. In Africa, we have overthrown more than 140 constitutions since independence. And we, without fail, a lot of British countries, British colonized countries, became independent on a parliamentary system, but within 3 or 4 years, they had changed to a presidential system. So we've been overthrowing presidential systems, constitutions in Africa for the last 50 years. So the presidential system has not been good for the continent, has not been good for any part of the world that I can describe. And there is a reason for it. The presidential system is a winner-take-all system. And it doesn't help in political bargaining. And if you've got a pluralistic, deeply divided society, what you want is a system that allows bargaining. Yeah. So now our system doesn't allow bargaining. Because once you win power, you treat it as a license to ignore anybody who did not vote for you. Historically, that's how power has been exercised in Kenya. And that's where the problem lies. So let me go back to where I'm saying that the people in Central Kenya should actually not fear the parliamentary system. The truth of the matter is that until other people feel comfortable, other non-Mount Kenya, non-Central Kenya people feel comfortable with the idea that every member of every ethnic community in Kenya has a realistic chance of exercising power. This problem is not going to go away. I mean, Kenya cannot be a relay race between the Kalenjins and the Kikuyus, which is what it's turning out to be. for 50, 60 years of independence. It's become a relay race. It's now even being stylized that way. That once Uhuru Kenyatta is out of power, he'll hand over to William Ruto. A country of 44 ethnic groups cannot operate that way.
Maybe just, what is the attraction to the presidential system? Because you're saying the presidential system actually has been shown not to work.
Yes.
Especially when you have diverse,
Yeah.
pluralistic society, different ethnic groups, which is what we are. These different identities will not be accommodated in the system.
Yeah.
But what is the attraction, and what is the driver? Has this been crafted by an elite?
Yeah.
Is it what we are used to? Is it a sense of security? Is it a fear of having a negotiated bargaining kind of system?
Yeah.
The sense that then, without a strong central government, everything will fall apart. What's the attraction?
Wanjiru, you've heard people say that what Kenya needs is a benevolent dictator. Now, where that is coming from, it's tapping into something that it's the bedazzlement with Asia. Places like Malaysia, places like Singapore, where they had strong leaders who seemed to get their countries out of poverty into development, and now increasingly more of those countries are becoming free. So there's a sense in which people feel that there's an efficiency that a CEO like leader seems to bring to power that is very attractive. So there is a social. When people live in a chaotic environment, there is this order, there is this preference for order and efficiency that is at the back of their mind when they pine for the presidential system. From a personal point of view, if you are the president, it's very unambiguous. Presidential system is very unambiguous. You are the president, you are the commander-in-chief, you do not need the confidence of parliament to be in office. Unlike in a parliamentary system where you day by day you negotiate with members of parliament to stay in office. So you don't have to do political bargaining on an ongoing basis, which is what a parliamentary system is about. It's on an ongoing bargaining. Now, so those are the personal and social reasons for it. The problem is, if you are in a deeply divided society, especially a society like ours, where, as I said earlier, identity and geography are related, and then power and geography are related. When you have a country like ours, it is inevitable that people will feel that they were born into the wrong tribe. That if they had been born into the right tribe, they would have a realistic chance of becoming a president or what. So that's the problem with in the context of Kenya. What you need is a system that realistically gives everybody an equal shot, where it says, yes, we shall vote we shall use the electoral system to get a leader, but the leader can come from any community because there is a realistic chance of a leader coming from any community. So long as we keep buying into this idea of tyranny of numbers and tyranny of the majority, and we have a presidential system, and we don't want electoral reform along the lines of proportional representation, what's going to happen over the years is this entrenchment of the central highlands of the Rift and Mount Kenya. That entrenchment is going to continue.
Can I just go back to the question, the point you made about Asia?
Yeah.
Because we've really picked Asia, the Asian tigers, as our model.
Yeah.
We put this in our Vision 2030. Of course, Singapore, South Korea had a number of things that we don't have. They have a very homogeneous community, so they are not divided along tribal lines. They also have a culture that that didn't seem to be aligned to corruption, a lower tolerance for corruption. Could you speak a bit to this, and how can we deal with our ethnicity positively?
Yeah.
And will the parliamentary system help us? And then how do we deal with the state capture of economic systems, the corruption issue?
Yeah. Let's first of all get rid of a few myths about the so-called Asian miracle. Mm-hmm. First, what people don't often appreciate is the fact that Asia didn't grow because it was dictatorial. No, the software of development was in place, which is education, health, the things that make countries grow. There was actually, surprisingly, reasonably efficient justice systems. So the things that people don't address are the factors that actually explain Asia. Are investments in education, investments in health, investments in property rights. Even the most dictatorial of countries in Asia have those things. Those things were in place. If you look at the levels of education in South Korea, for instance, people keep saying, "Oh, Kenya was growing at the same rate with South Korea in the 60s." If you look at the education attainment in South Korea in the 60s, Kenya didn't attain the same levels of education until late 90s, early 2000s. So Korea already had the basic investment in the things that drive growth. Okay. Now, what has happened in Africa? We keep citing the Southeast Asia as examples that we are emulating, but in fact, none of the dictatorships in Africa invested in any of the things that Asia had invested in to achieve the growth that they had. Okay, so that's the first problem. So I mean, and you could actually make the argument by more concrete by looking at Kenya. Kenya did a lot more development in the 10 years of freedom under Kibaki. Freedom, I use the word advisedly, but still, comparatively to the 24 years of the Moi dictatorship, our worst performance economically was under the Moi dictatorship, which then raises the question, dictatorship is not the explanation for development. Similarly, the relative freedom that people enjoyed under Kibaki isn't the explanation for development either. You need a combination of things. The thing about freedom and the reason why democracy is correlated around the world with growth is democracy introduces a thing that business people really like: predictability. You know that the next president of the country will be chosen through a peaceful process. You can plan for 30 years instead of planning for a period of time that you're not sure about. Because in a dictatorship, the problem is, so long as the dictator is in power, and he's guaranteeing you access and he's guaranteeing you friendly policy, you are sure that you're in business. But the dictator could be shut out of office. Yeah, and if the dictator is shut out of office, then you can't plan your life beyond the life of the dictator. Yeah, I mean, if you look at Africa, for just one last point, if you look at Africa between 1960 to 1994, 23 heads of state and prime ministers were killed or violently overthrown from power. Now, if you are an investor in an environment like that, where the way you get rid of people from office is through the bullet or through violence, you can't plan your life beyond the life of the dictator. Yeah. So there is an argument to be made that we are looking at the wrong thing in Asia. Yeah.
We have seen around the election, the delegitimization of the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
We have seen Parliament use its legislative powers to delegitimize the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Politicians attack the Supreme Court. So we are finding that, and we've also heard from the chair and the commissioner who resigned, interference with the IBC.
Yeah.
So we are witness to a system right now that is attacking the independence of institutions.
Yeah.
How does that augur in terms of where we are headed?
Yeah.
And how should Kenyans be viewing this process?
I argued from 2013 when Uhuru Kenyatta was elected president. I argued that the way in which Uhuru Kenyatta finances politics and the way in which he finances politics in 2017 made it inevitable that he would attack institutions. I call this a contractor democracy. It's a democracy in which, or it's an electoral system in which people who have financed the Jubilee have been contracted. It's procurement. It's a procurement. By contractor, I don't mean the people who do roads. I mean the people who live off government contracts. Those are the financiers of government. And it's not an accident, in my view, that as a result of that, the government has got this addiction to big projects. This is just an avenue for financiers to get some money. Now, if you have a contractor model of politics, one of the things you don't want are strong institutions. Because if you have strong institutions, then you cannot make a decision about who gets your contracts, who gets contracts. because those decisions will be made by institutions. They'll be made by procurement authorities. If you go to court, there will be independent judges to make decisions. So if your anti-corruption authorities are strong, they will investigate them. So that model of politics cannot abide strong institutions, because the stronger the institution is, the more likely it is to frustrate the process of earmarking and funneling contracts to financiers. So that's the core of the problem. Now, the long-term problem is that once institutions become weak, then when you've got non-negotiable conflicts of the variety we are getting into right now, because I don't think we've really gotten into the real conflict. The real conflict after the 26th, in my view. What we have, what we are seeing is symptomatic of the deeper malaise we are going to get after the 26th. My thinking is that when we get to that situation, if you don't have strong institutions that can mediate political conflict, you have no choice but to get into violence. Because the thing that stops violence is the ability to go to an arbiter who both sides trust. Now, where would that arbiter be? In a political sense, that would be Parliament. Now, Parliament cannot arbitrate anything right now because Parliament is one side. The other institution would be the judiciary. The judiciary cannot arbitrate anything right now because Jubilee seems to think the judiciary is a stalking horse for the opposition. The executive cannot play any role because the executive is what we are contesting, is what the two people are contesting. So where do you turn? Civic institutions have weakened over the years. So the churches, despite the amount of noise they are making, the churches no longer have the moral authority to speak out. And the reason why they have no moral authority is they've been embedded in the corruption economies. I mean, I have seen many cases, I think all of us know these cases, where a guy has made money in 5-6 years, turns up in a rural community, there's a church being constructed, contributes the roofing sheets, buys new pews, and is canonized effectively. You're canonized and made a church elder, and you're all hunky-dory. The church doesn't ask you, how did you make this money? You left this place as a poor teacher, now you are a minister and rich. The church doesn't ask these questions. So the moral institutions of the society, whether it's churches, whether it's schools, have been completely bastardized. And they have been in this, they are not in a situation anymore where they can speak out and be listened credibly. And this is the problem, that if whatever institution you look at, whether those institutions are in the state or they are social, the only safe space remaining in Kenya right now is your tribe. Safe in the sense that the one place you can go and talk to people politics and get a hearing and get sympathy in this country is your tribe, which is pathetic.
When you say that, actually, then you're implying that the drivers for conflict are really at high gear.
Yes.
Because our institutions are weakened,
yeah,
and are being weakened actually by state action. And Kenyans have bought into this. So you have the followers of Jubilee, yeah, whereas they may be in support of the president, have also condoned the targeting of institutions. And so I think there's a need for us really to let Kenyans know the extent to which our institutions are weakened and not supported.
Absolutely.
Only leaves us with the avenue of violence, because this conflict is real.
What has happened, which is a very worrying and scary thing, what has happened is that there's a theory in game theory. There's a phrase in game theory which I like, which is the idea of nested games. And let me try. It's a technical thing. Let me try and explain it. You see, what happens is, if you think of life as a game where we are interacting with you, you do something, and then I anticipate what you'll do, then I react to it. If you think of life that way, I should be able to predict your behavior. I should be able to say, I know what is motivating Wanjiru. Wanjiru is motivated by X, Y, Z. If I touch this, I know she will react this way. Now, the theory of nested game says, sometimes that's not what's driving Wanjiru. Maybe Wanjiru is caught up in another game you don't know. Yeah, and therefore, what you think would be her rational response to your your action turns out not to be a rational response. She reacts in a way you think is irrational. Now, ethnicity is a little bit like that. each community is caught up in a game that another community cannot explain rationally. For instance, you would think, knowing Kikuyus are business people, you would think that a nationally predictable environment everywhere in the country, including Luo land, including Luya land, where they would like to trade and do business, you would think that it's in their interest that the relationship between them and the Luyas should be hunky-dory. That's what you'd think. If you listen to Kikuyu political rhetoric, for instance, or you'd be surprised. You'd be, this doesn't make sense from a rational point of view. You would think that Luos, to some extent, who've got a very large professional cadre, that it would be in their interest that Kikuyu businesses are successful, because a lot of them will end up, if the Kikuyu businesses, the big Kikuyu businesses are also employers. So you would think that a relationship with the Kikuyus is a useful relationship because it creates opportunities for them. But again, when you listen to their rhetoric, it doesn't work that way. So what's going on? What's going on is that both communities are trapped in other games with their leaders, in which demonization of the other is the route to power. Yeah, and this is not just Kikuyus and Luos. It's I think the logic of ethnicity. The logic of ethnicity is that the route to power seems, in the short term at least, seems to involve acting counter-rationally to your long-term interest. It seems to be built on that. And the reason is, you have to remember that a politician's planning horizon is 5 years. So they are not interested in your long-term welfare. They are interested in their short-term goals. And their short-term goals is to be in power. And every leader in Kenya knows, once I'm in power, I have 10 years max. And I'll be out of power. So if the country burns after 10 years, why does it matter to me? And that's where it is. So that we have now mobilized our identities and our ethnic groups on the theory that since our interests are short-term, we are going to focus on short-term. Now, the communities are buying into this without realizing that actually their long-term interests are together rather than apart. And therein lies the problem.
Right. This is a scary scenario, nested games, and short-term, interests, which is all in play. Demonization to an extent that there's a rabid fear, of opposition leader and dialogue.
Yeah.
But what has to happen? Because this is a moving train.
Yeah.
We are a going concern that we are readily going to go off the rails.
Yeah.
What needs to happen, considering all these intense factors?
Yeah.
What must happen?
What must happen is, in one word, is dialogue. But it's
Dialogue about what?
Yes, that's what I was going to say. What must happen in the short run is dialogue. So far as I'm concerned, not dialogue about postponement of the election. I think that's a completely, that train left the station a long time ago. And that will not happen because Uhuru Kenyatta needs an election. And because he needs an election, the entire state machinery is going to be mobilized to deliver that election, whatever the quality of the election. Now, so the dialogue that needs to happen is this is a constitutional moment, as some people have said. We need to go back to the unfinished business of making a constitution that reflects Kenya. No, and I'm not saying that we make a whole constitution we go back to making a fresh new constitution. But what I'm saying is the constitution, at a minimum, must address our problems, our structural problems. If it doesn't address our structural problems, we're not going to make progress. How do we get there? My sense is that at some point, a conversation between Uhuru and Raila Odinga is inevitable. Unfortunately, because of the family situation I described between the two of them, the likelihood of that conversation happening now or in the next maybe month or so is not. I'm not optimistic about it. I am not one of those who believes that it's going to happen sooner. I think it will happen a little later. And the reason is this: Uhuru has done exactly what his father did, which is to buy into this idea that control of the state is the absolute critical factor that you need to have to be president, and that moral and political legitimacy doesn't really matter, because once you have effective control of government and effective control of the state, you are fine. That, I think, is what is going on in his head. That's why he must have the election on 26th. Now, times have changed, though. When his father was able to do this in the 60s because Kenya was less educated, people were less exposed, the divisions, there was a bit of the emotional feel-good factor of independence, which helped. The barbarities of the colonial government were still very fresh in people's minds. So there were a lot of, there was a historical conjuncture of several forces that explained why his father was able to do this with a fair amount of ease. Those circumstances don't exist. And that's number one. Number two, Kenyans have experienced multi-party democracy now for what, 25 years almost. So it isn't going to be, this is not going to be something that is easy to wish away. Taking us back to 1990 is not a viable option. So that his control of Uhuru Kenyatta's control of the state without fussing about nationwide political legitimacy is a really big problem. Now, the fact that Raila Odinga feels that he has this moral legitimacy from the Supreme Court makes it probably makes him dig in terms of the things he will be willing to negotiate at this point. He wasn't in that position in 2013 because the Supreme Court then said Uhuru Kenyatta had won. So Kenyatta had the moral legitimacy, the legal and political legitimacy was with Kenyatta because of that. Now it isn't with Kenyatta anymore. So you've got two leaders who control different aspects of legitimacy. You've got formal legitimacy in terms of the law, and you've got moral and political legitimacy in terms of the structure of Kenya and arising direct from the Supreme Court decision. So I don't see the mindset for negotiations at this point. But the question that most people have is, if we get to negotiations, what should be negotiated? My reading of what Jubilee is saying, we cannot negotiate coalition government. We are not going to. Nusu Mkate is out. The thing I've had from the other side, to the extent that I speak to people on both sides, the thing I've heard from the other side is that their goal is not Nusu Mkate. But there are people, I think the view is split. There are people who are prepared to discuss Nusu Mkate. I don't think talks should begin there. Mm-hmm. I don't think talks should begin. Yes, I think the talks should begin on a framework for resolving the crisis long term. Agreeing the framework, first of all, how negotiations will take place, what is on the table, what is not on the table. If they want to put Nusu Mkate on the table, they can put Nusu Mkate on the table. But I think it is important to agree, because what happened in 2007, we resolved the political crisis. We agreed on the constitution. We did not address all of Agenda 4 items, which is we didn't address those. And those Agenda 4 items are still the things that are biting us now. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think a framework that begins to address some of those historical issues that I raised at the beginning, that I think is critical.
Okay, now you brought in Agenda 4. Before we get to Agenda 4, there was a civil society press statement yesterday talking about the need for deep electoral reforms.
Yes.
Which I imagine is now discussing the presidential versus the parliamentary
and
process.
the voting system.
And the voting system.
Yeah.
And maybe you can speak a little bit to that.
Yeah.
But there was also the issue of the state crackdown on freedom of assembly.
Yeah.
Also the issue of securitization, mobilization of militias.
Yeah.
Could you speak, to these issues, and how important is it that these get pinned down?
Yes, I think let's first of all do the securitization, because that's a trend. I have gotten quite alarmed over the last 5 years of the Uhuru presidency. It's got a certain attraction to military types, and we've seen quite a few sort of ex-military people get into fairly significant civilian roles, and of itself, the fact that somebody was in the military and takes a civilian role, of itself, it is not a big deal. I mean, if you think about the number of American presidents who are generals, the Eisenhowers of this earth, the Ulysses S. Grant of this earth. If you think about the number of generals who became presidents, it's not unusual because the military is a good place to learn certain types of leadership skills. The thing that bothered me is the mindset, the way this gives me a peek into the mindset of the president. The sense of his attraction to law and order, with a lot of emphasis on order, and his language too. And maybe it is something we've seen a bit of in Magufuli too. Because if you think about Magufuli and you think about Uhuru, they're comparable in interesting ways. Both of them were very keen to be liked. There are people who are very keen to be liked. You saw Uhuru when he was running for the presidency in 2013. Very charming, yeah, very charming, very cool. He's with it. You know, he was very keen to be liked. I was saying to a group of people the other day, my sense of people like that is that if they sense they are being disliked, yeah, their next instinct is to be feared. They want to be feared or shown respect, if you see what I mean. And a lot of the securitization, a lot of the approach I have seen of the Uhuru administration seems to me to come from that background of like, look, I am the president, and I'm going to do X, Y, Z. So there's a bit of a compensation from being liked now to this almost very hardline. Actually, not almost, actually very hardline approach to. I think there's also a fundamental distrust of constitutional processes, freedom of assembly, freedom of right to protest, freedom of expression. Instinctively, there is something in the administration that is hostile to this idea. And you've had a lot of Uhuru people say, the president could have done more, even fight corruption, if the constitution didn't tie his hands. So that the mindset of the administration has been the constitution is a problem. Not an opportunity, but a problem. And that's not a very good thing for constitutional government. So that part of the question relating to this securitization. Yes, I mean, you cannot begin an analysis of Bill of Rights by saying rights have limits. The Constitution doesn't guarantee you limits. It guarantees you rights. You've got to begin with people exercising rights. And then only when those rights get into other people's way, into the way of other people, would you then say, okay, now there are limits to rights. But you don't begin with limits. What was the other?
We were talking about the critical things that need to happen.
Yes.
So what are the deep electoral reforms? I know we've touched on it.
True. That's what I was thinking about. Mm-hmm. Now, first of all, I think in terms of institutional design, it is important, and let me be very concrete on this. It's very important we address both devolution, we address the presidency, and we address the electoral system. Let's begin with the devolution. We devolved power, but we devolved power in a way that is a little bit incoherent. If you think about the Senate, for instance, the Senate is the primary national institution for protecting devolution. Senators are directly elected. Senators have no connection with counties, and they're supposed to protect them. Now, what has happened is that because senators have an electoral mandate that is comparable to the electoral mandate of the governor, there has been a contestation of legitimacies, if you see what I mean. So the senators have felt we are designated by the Constitution as the oversight mechanism for governors, and we have an electoral mandate from the people. We represent the people. So they have gotten into a fight with governors. Yeah. So instead of becoming the protecting mechanism, in fact, in many ways, they have created the language that allows people who don't believe in devolution at the national level to say devolution doesn't work. I don't think the intention of the senators have been to weaken devolution, but I think the way in which they've gone about implementing how they think the oversight role should be implemented has actually fed into the rhetoric of devolution doesn't work, devolution is expensive. So that needs to be redesigned. Typically, there are two ways of resolving it. Either You make Senate, if they're directly elected like they're in America, you make it a full legislative chamber with all powers, so that they are busy with other things. They are full, and their primary responsibility is not necessarily to protect devolution. It is to be a full legislative chamber that has power of revision even on stuff that the National Assembly does.
An upper house.
It's an upper house, if you like. The language raises hackles in Parliament. But yes, an upper house of sorts. Or alternatively, you make them a mechanism for protecting counties, like South Africa or Germany, or Ethiopia, probably not a good example, but Ethiopia has got the same logic, where they are either elected through a process that involves the county governments, or they are elected by county assemblies, so that they become a mechanism for protection. So that's the first set of problems related to devolution, that the architecture of devolution is strong, as it is right now. And it doesn't help the senators, it's not helping governors. Because senators feel powerless vis-a-vis the National Assembly, and then where they feel most powerful, their role hasn't been benign. It's been malignant. Number one. Number two, the presidency. A presidential system, as a winner-take-all system, has a logic that is faulty. The logic of the system is that the majority, democracy is government of the people, by the people, for the people. Government of the people, by the people, typically translates into a government by majority. But if you think about the definition, it ideally means everybody. Government of the people means government of everybody. By the people means government of everybody. And the truth of the matter is that that's not realistic. Everybody will not agree so that's why we go to majority. Government for the people means it's for everybody. That's not a majority. When a government gets elected, nothing in democratic theory says that the government exists to serve the people who voted for it. It exists to serve everybody. What has happened is, not only do we elect government by majority, we treat government once it's in office as if it is for the majority. You've heard President Kenyatta in Mombasa saying, "You didn't vote for me," whatnot. I mean, sort of explicitly making the claim that you didn't vote for me, and therefore I really don't have an obligation to treat you nicely. That basically was the subtext. I really don't have an obligation. In other words, what we have done what the presidential system does is to take a minimum condition, because majority rule is a minimum condition. A country can't be a democracy unless it has majority rule. But a country isn't fully democratic merely because it has majority rule, if you see what I mean. But we've taken that, the fact that a country has majority rule, as signifying that the country is a maximum democracy. So we've taken a minimum condition and made it maximum. So the presidential system has got that tendency to give majorities the impression that they've got a writ and a warrant to treat people who didn't vote for them the way they wish. So that's the second thing. You need to think about the presidential system, and you need to think about it in the context of what I said earlier, that democracy doesn't do well in presidential systems. It does much better in parliamentary system. I don't think it's an accident that in Central and Eastern Europe, the countries that switched to the parliamentary system, the Slovenias, the Czech Republics, the countries that switched to the parliamentary system have actually been more stable than the countries that went presidential. The countries further east, the Ukraines of this earth. So I don't think it's an accident. So that's number two, the question of how you design the presidency. The third question is how you design the electoral system. We argued when the constitution was being made, a few of us, we argued that Kenya needed a proportional representation system. Now, a proportional representation system works in terms of you want to represent as many people as possible in parliament. So anybody who gets a threshold number of votes, which you can agree with, 3, 4, 5%, whatever you agree, get entitled to a seat in parliament. Which is what a proportional representation system allows you to do is to take care of, first, small ethnic groups, and then number two, non-geographical minorities or nation small business. You are in Meru, you are in Mombasa, so if you think about the Asian community collectively, they are probably not ever going to win a geographical constituency because they are not concentrated enough in any particular constituency to meet our constituency-based system. But if you say that a party that gets a threshold number of votes will be entitled to seats in parliament, then so long as that group is mobilized into politics and vote for that party, if we turn out to be 15%, then they will get 15% of the number of seats available in parliament. So we need to start thinking about that. Because when this was proposed, the way the elite responded was to create these set-aside programs where you say so many number of youths, so many number of women, so many. That was our idea of proportionality. But that's not proportionality. Those are set-aside programs. And set-aside programs are vulnerable in terms of critique. They are vulnerable to the same problems that the presidential system is vulnerable to, which is the fact that a lot of times they end up being a situation of elite bargaining about which those people are. So that it doesn't come from the people, it comes from party barons sitting in a room and agreeing the people who we are going to use to fill up this quota are going to be this ones.
Unfortunately, it's been the girlfriends.
Yes,
the second girlfriend.
Yes, absolutely.
The sister of.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately.
Absolutely.
And I think when you talk about that, you're also talking about the quality of representation
Absolutely.
of the member of National Assembly,
Absolutely.
who are so busy preoccupied with having constituency development funds,
Yes,
because there is a disconnect in that representation.
Absolutely.
Now, because we are out of time, we've been asked to wind up, and I think we've covered a lot of ground. My last question is going to be, how can this take place? Because we've got, intransigence.
Yes.
We've got an ideological divide, really, between the president and Raila.
Yeah.
It sounds like some blood must be spilt. This is being very negative, but realistically, it's sounding like some blood must be spilled.
Yes, and I think the grim outlook, which you might say I have presented, the grim outlook. What this I hope is a wake up call for non-political sectors, whether it's business, whether it's churches, whether it's civil society. I think when I listen to those sectors talk, there's a sort of there's a little bit of I don't know what to describe it as, but there's this thing: you're not reliable enough. You're not, there's an exchange. Business saying to civil society, you're too radical. Civil society saying to business, you are always in bed with the executive. Both saying to the church leaders, no, you always want to take leadership when things like this happen. So that the leadership outside of the political establishment has been rather polarized themselves, in a way reflecting the larger polarities in the politics. But I think at this time, because they don't have the same stakes in power, they have the stakes in the future of Kenya, but they don't have the same stakes in power. I think it is important that alternative leadership gets together in an urgent way to begin to frame. But if they were being pushed, because eventually they must negotiate. But if they were being pushed by a group that is saying, look, you have an interest in the executive and the control of the executive. We have an interest in Kenya as a going concern. If you have a group that can articulate that, and a group that is broad-based, trade unions, whatever you think about them, if you have a group that is broad-based, then it is possible to begin having a conversation about what is the nature of the dialogue that we need to have, what needs to be its elements, and how do we have a framework. If there is an unaddressed agenda, whether it's on elections, whether it's on devolution, or whether it's on the presidency and the presidential system, if there is a framework for discussing those issues, what should that framework look like, and who should participate in it? I think that's where we should be heading.
Last question. Do you have any thoughts on how to bring Kenyans on board? Because there's a sense where Kenyans are very polarized, very divided, and are really not on board with many of these issues. Any thoughts? How do we turn that?
You see, I have this theory. I mean, maybe I'm mistaken. I have the theory that Raila Odinga, whatever you think about him, leads his people. I have the theory that Uhuru Kenyatta follows his people. In the sense that he anticipates where the Kikuyu will be, and puts himself in front of them. I mean, if you look at how, for example, he withdrew from the endorsement of Musalia Mudavadi, I don't think he withdrew from endorsing Musalia Mudavadi because he had a change of mind. He recognized, and he must have been told by Kikuyus, that if you endorse Musalia Mudavadi, we are not going to vote for him. So I am sure that's the message that was sent to him. We are not going to vote for him. We'll vote for someone else. So he is not able to move the Kikuyus. In fact, the only leader I think who was able to move the Kikuyus was Matiba. Matiba would have taken the Kikuyu vote to Jaramogi, but I don't think Uhuru can take the Kikuyu vote to a particular political coalition where the Kikuyus don't want to go, and because he hasn't shown himself that way. So the people around him need to understand that. Having said that, my understanding is long term is that the leaders in the short run, if they agree something, even if their constituencies are unhappy in the short run, they will probably go along because a lot of people don't want violence, although it now soon looks increasingly inevitable. A lot of people don't want violence. And a lot of people, the people who will suffer most from the violence, in a strange way, it's actually Kenyatta's constituency. Kenyatta's constituency will pay the highest price from a business perspective. So it is important that the first step has to be the leadership de-escalating, because whatever you think about them, their escalation escalates the and you have to remember also, I mean, just a little aside, you have to remember, genuinely, other than the few Kikuyus and Luos who live in Nairobi, the Kikuyus and the Luos they've got no beef with each other, strictly speaking. They are not neighbors. They are not neighboring communities. Historically, you can see why there is a problem in the Rift Valley, Kikuyu Kalenjin. You can see the sources of that problem. They're each other's neighbors, whatnot. So disagreements can become violent. You can see how that might happen. It's very difficult to see how the dispute between Kikuyus and Luos becomes this overarching driver of entire conflict in Kenya. They are so far apart. So in the short run, de-escalation by the leaders. In the long run, people will not de-escalate long-term and structurally unless they feel that the power is open. There's access to power that is open, and open in a way that is meaningful and that doesn't favor one side. What we have in Kenya is that we have an ethnic coalition that wants to become a permanent majority. That's a problem. So people who are outside of that are asking, so how are we ever going to get anywhere near power? And that's where the secession conversation is coming from. Yeah?
Okay.
That makes sense.
I forgot about the secession discussion.
Yes.
And since you brought it up,
Yes.
just a few notes on how viable is it? Is this the way we want to go? Is it inevitable?
I think there are two separate issues. There are two separate issues of the secession issue. There is an intellectual debate about at what point do countries begin talking secession. I mean, Zanzibar is talking secession. There's a conversation going on about it's been going on for a while. Eritrea, Ethiopia talked secession and actually actualized it. The Czech Republic and split from the Slovak. Catalonia is having that debate in Spain, and the Catalonians have got it. There's a Catalonian proverb that says that Spain is like a cow with its mouth in Catalonia and its udder in Madrid. So they would like to bring the whole cow. They would like to bring the whole cow to Catalonia, and a lot of secessionist debates revolve around fairness, whether the fairness is understood politically or understood economically. In the case of Spain, Catalonia understands this fairness economically. In the case of Zanzibar, there's a little bit of an economic argument, but the primary argument is political. The intellectual argument we're hearing in Kenya is basically a political justice argument. It's saying, we are excluded, you've decided Mount Kenya and Central Highlands of the Rift have decided this is their country, so why are they asking us to endorse it? That's really the intellectual course. Now, the question whether this is a viable claim I'm not sure. I mean, my sense is this. My sense is a bargaining chip. My sense is that this is a bargaining chip. That if you want to hog power, let's discuss the viability of the state. You can't claim a right to have the state, and you don't want us to claim the right not to be part of the state you want to hog. Yeah. So I think that's the ethical dimension of the argument. I think it's dangerous when it moves from debate to implementation, because I think the danger doesn't lie in the idea of secession. I mean, there is nothing about a state that indicates that the state is inevitable. It has to take a particular shape. That's not where the danger lies. The danger lies in what the people being mobilized see it as. Partition of countries, other than, say, in the case of, there have been a few velvet divorces, Ethiopia, Eritrea, but they fought after. Czechoslovakia, splitting into Slovakia and the Czech Republic. There have been a few velvet divorces where there isn't violence. And the one that was going to happen in Scotland, where they voted about it. But there hasn't been, we don't have a history of peaceful breakup. We don't have a long history of peaceful breakups in the world, and even and especially in Africa, other than the case of Ethiopia. So a lot of political actors and gangs and whatever have got the theory that if you talk partition, it's a basis for expulsion of people who are not from your ethnic group now. So that's where the danger lies. The danger lies in the fact that we are not able to have this debate in the way that Czechoslovakia had it, in the way that Ethiopia had it before they went into war later, much later. We are not able to have it that way. And we are not able to have it that way because we've got a history where our identity has been the basis on which we have killed each other. So that's why so we got a history that makes it impossible to have this debate and to in a way that is reasonable. And especially when you've got the elite that controls the state feeling, actually, this is something we cannot even allow to be debated. So yeah, I mean, I think it's in many ways a red herring. But what it points to is that there is value in having this deeper debate about what needs to be done in Kenya, what reforms need to be done in Kenya. Because if those reforms were done, I am not sure many people would have a problem continuing to keep Kenya as a going concern. I mean, I for one enjoy visiting different parts of the country. I would like to be able to visit different parts of the country without being told you are one of the Mount Kenya Mafia or something of the sort. Because what the problem with this retreat into ethnic identity is that it never really distinguishes people on the basis of their ideology. So even if you said you are sympathetic to a particular cause, intermarriages. I mean, when my larger family meets, there's a mini UN. So when the debates take place about breaking away and breaking apart and whatever, I am not sure, where you are supposed to go. Yeah.
Wachira, thank you so much for your time. And I believe there are fundamental discussions that need to take place. And we need to put all these on the table and, create a safe space where that can happen. And beyond that, I think we pray for our country and call on the alternative leadership to play their role. Thank you very much.